lesson on animal studies in attachment. So really, in order to understand these two studies, you need to watch the YouTube video clips that I've attached on the PowerPoint presentation. But if you turn to page 16 in your attachment booklet, which hopefully when we get into school next week, you'll get the opportunity to print off. And first of all, we'll start off by having a look at the first study, which is by Lorenz. And you can see a picture there, if I can just make that a little bit bigger for you. You should be able to see, oh, it's not great that, a little bit of explaining a little bit more about what Lorenz actually does. So the first term that you need to understand is imprinting, and imprinting is defined as an innate readiness to develop a strong bond with the mother. It takes place during a specific time in development, and that's usually in the first few hours after birth or after hatching. And the theory of imprinting suggests that if it doesn't happen at that time, it will probably never happen. There's another document here that you can refer to, and again, I've got that definition there. So imprinting is kind of something that is innate, so it's biological, so it's a kind of evolutionary adaptive trait. So it's something that you can't control, so therefore we've got this idea of determinism, and it's something that you can't change, and it's almost like a kind of force. So Lorenz's study is a study of imprinting, and I'll go to this, although you can see here that you've got it in your booklet, so if you want to go and have a look at that, you can do, but I'm just going to refer to this sheet because I think it kind of condenses it a little bit better. So we'll go and have a look at this, and you should have this on Teams. So he basically divided a clutch of eggs into two halves, and he's used goslings. Now, AQA want you to know who the sample is in this study. So the sample is basically goslings, and you don't have to know how many because we don't actually know how many. But basically, he waited for a clutch of eggs. He split them up into two halves. One half was left to hatch with the mum. Now they're the control group because there's no manipulation there or anything. And the other half were hatched in an incubator. And when they hatched, the first moving object they saw, the first person they saw was Lorenz. So they did not see another goose at all. They just saw Lorenz. So that's the study. And obviously what happened then was to follow what happened over the coming months. So the control group continued to behave as normal. They followed their mother goose everywhere. But the second group, so the experimental group if you like, followed Lorenz. So he marked the goslings to indicate which group of eggs had hatched from and let out to be with the mum. He then marked obviously the group of eggs, the group of goslings who were going to be hatched following him. Each gosling went straight to its mother figure, and you can see from the diagram and from some of the images, if I just put one up of this study, you can see that the goslings did actually follow Lorenz, and it's quite cute when you actually watch it and you actually see for yourself what they did. But if we just go and have a quick look at this here, and I'll just sort of try to make this a little bit smaller so that you can see. There we go. You can see that this is actually Lorenz with his goslings. So you know, we've got a little bit here. This is evolutionary. I'll talk about what that means where we've got the peacock there when I actually see you. But you can see that these goslings actually followed him. They actually went swimming with him. And they treated him as if he was their mother figure completely. So we'll go back to this. So, interestingly as well, the goslings showed no recollection of their real mother. So what he found from this is if a young animal, and in this case a bird, is not exposed to a moving object, Lorenz believed the animal will not imprint. And the reason we're looking at this is because this is a process very similar to attachment. it binds a young animal to a caregiver, but this is completely innate. Okay, he extended the study here, which is quite interesting. He got young ducks and goslings to imprint on objects such as rubber gloves and Wellington boots. Okay, so that's the main study by Lorenz, and if we just go back to this, you can see here that you've got a little bit of the findings. You don't really need much more detail to that, although I think there is some in the PowerPoint. So, moving on to the next study, which is the study by Harlow. And Harlow's study is quite a harrowing study, actually, and it's probably one of the most harrowing studies in psychology, and that's because of the choice of sample that he uses. So Harlow, very controversial research. Harlow looked at rhesus monkeys, and again you do need to know that, because if you're asked by AQA who were the sample used, so he used 16 monkeys who were separated from the mother immediately after birth. And if you remember the previous presentation that I showed you, that is a big problem because we are using a species that we should not be using. But because this was carried out, I know it says 1988 here, but that was when the study, a psychologist looked at the study to study the effects of privation, but the original study was done in the 1950s. And at that point, it was seen as being acceptable to use monkeys in research. So the monkeys were placed in cages with access to 2 surrogate mothers. One was made of wire and one was covered in a soft terry toweling cloth. And if you have a look here, this is actually the soft mother, and it doesn't look great. It's not particularly comforting, but this is quite soft. That is actually Harry Harlow there. And if you see here, we'll just make this, you can have a look, we've got a choice of 2 mothers. I know it's quite small, but we've got one here which is just wire, and the other which has cloth over it. So I just want to make it clear that there is a bit of a distinction there. So one's made of wire, and the wire monkey they could get milk from. But we have actually got some different variations on this. So number 1, 8 of the monkeys could get milk from the wire mother, and number 2, 8 of the monkeys could get milk from the cloth mother, and they were studied for various lengths of time. So both groups of monkeys spent the majority of time with the cloth mother, and that is the main finding of this study. And this is a study that is seen as it's quite an informative study, because that is not what Harry Harlow expected at all. And that's because he genuinely expected that monkeys would form their attachment based on who fed them. But he did not expect the monkeys to want to spend all that time with the cloth mother, especially if she had no milk. So the infants in the second group would only go onto the wire monkey when they were hungry. And the second that they finished feeding, they would return to the cloth mother and stay there for the rest of the day. So what can we conclude from that? Why are they going to the cloth mother? Because they want warmth and comfort. And therefore, that tells us that the mother figure is not just about feeding, there is more to it. And this actually really challenges the learning theory, which I know we've not looked at yet, but we are going to be looking at over the next few lessons. It really does challenge the learning theory of attachment, because it suggests that animals do actually form an attachment based on something more than food, and that is possibly comfort, warmth, love, and so on. So Harlow observed the differences between the monkeys who'd grown up with the surrogate mothers and those with the normal mothers, and he found that they were much more timid. The monkeys did not know how to behave with other monkeys and could be quite aggressive. They had difficulty mating. The females were inadequate mothers and often killed their offspring. Now, what's quite interesting about this is, therefore, what can we conclude? That attachment in those early months, those early days even, is absolutely vital for normal attachment and, more importantly, for the development of normal relationships. And if we have a look at the monkeys who were not brought up in a normal environment, they were unable to form appropriate attachments. So if we have a look at the conclusions down here, Harlow concluded that contact comfort provided by the cloth mother was much more important than food in the formation of attachment. It also shows that contact comfort is preferable to food, but not sufficient. So this early maternal deprivation did lead to emotional damage. But what he did find was if the monkeys were put back with other monkeys and socialised before 3 months, then this maternal deprivation could in some way be reversed. But if the attachment was not made during this 3 months, this was irreversible. So what this actually taught us was that there is actually a critical period in the formation of attachments. Another key term that you need to be aware of, and you're going to be hearing about this term a lot throughout this unit. So this is just really, you need to learn these studies from looking at the videos and reading them through yourself. But I hope this has given you a little bit of help. If we go back now to the booklet, you can see that you've got the study in there. What I want you to now do is have a look at some of the evaluation for this, and just have a look at the sort of questions that you could be asked. Outline Lorenz's animal study of attachment or animal studies of attachment. In your answer, refer to what he did and what he found out. Now, this is actually a very straightforward question, because what he did in Lorenz's case is very kind of vague. It's not an experimental procedure. We don't know how many goslings. The detail is not going to be there for that. Whereas if you're asked question 2, describe one study by Harlow related to attachment, then you are going to be able to give a lot more detail for that. If we just go down here, briefly evaluate Harlow's animal study. Well, the first way you're going to evaluate this is by looking at animal ethics. So we've got ethics of psychological harm and trauma. And if you watch the videos, it is very harrowing, the way that the monkeys reacted to being separated from their mothers. But not just that, the way that they reacted when they were scared by some of the things that Harlow did, clearly suggesting that these were animals that were in distress. Also, the fact that the monkeys were crying so much indicates that there was some distress around this. We've obviously got the ethical issues of lack of consent and so on, but be very careful with this, because you don't want to go down the route of saying animals can't give consent, because that's obvious that animals can't give consent. But what you can do is say that this is a problem because this is largely a protected species who do show a lot of human traits, and therefore this is a further ethical issue, if you like. The other issue, of course, we've got with this is generalisation to humans, but you could argue that we can extrapolate some of the findings of this to humans. But one of the main issues with Harlow's study, if you think about it, is did it have to have been done to know this? Surely we know that separating any animal from its mother from birth is a harrowing experience, and we don't really need to study this to find that out, to know that that would be the case. And the study went on and did actually cause some irreversible effects. So your main issues here are going to be ethical issues, the fact that the animals were not able to be put back into their original environment, the fact that therefore they had in a lot of cases been damaged for life. If you're asked to describe and evaluate animal studies of attachment, I know this is 12 marks and obviously you're going to get 16 marks. You need to force around 6 marks. Describe them. They don't have to be balanced. You can focus on one study more than the other, the study that you perhaps prefer or understand more than the other. And when you're evaluating them, it's probably best to evaluate them quite differently, because when you're looking at Lorenz's study is generally quite positive, because we've learnt about imprinting and those goslings weren't particularly suffering in any way. Whereas what we've learnt from Harlow's study, we've learnt pretty much the same thing, that there are effects, but really you could argue on a cost-benefit analysis that this study didn't need to be done. You can obviously also talk about the fact that he only used one type of monkey, which are rhesus monkeys, and he only used a sample of 16, and again there could be something unique. Remember, of course, he didn't study any of these monkeys in a natural environment. They were all in complete experimental, controlled and manipulated conditions. And one of the other things, of course, is that the animals could have shown extreme fear because they were caged. They weren't in the natural environment, and therefore you could argue that it makes it difficult for us to draw conclusions from that, and it questions the validity of the research. If you just go back to have a look at some of the evaluation points that are mentioned in here, we've got the ethical issues, but we've also got the practical value here. One of the arguably strengths of Harlow's research is that it does have very important implications for in a range of practical contexts. So it's helped social workers understand risk factors. It's also helped us understand, and probably the most important thing, this idea of a critical period. And it's really helped zoo workers to understand how they can integrate animals into the zoo and try to make them feel more comfortable and more adjusted, if you like. So don't just think that everything is quite negative. There are some positives about these pieces of research, because after all, one of the strengths of using animals in research is that we are able to study in a way that we can't with humans. So if there are any questions on this, please get back to me, and hopefully when I meet you next week, we'll be able to watch the videos of this and have a bit of a discussion. Please set up a chat and get hold of me if you have any questions. Thank you.